The reject pile behind Larson's sawmill sat at the edge of the property like a wound the mill didn't want to look at. Knotty ends, split boards, wedges of oak too warped to sell, too twisted to stack. Every week the loader dumped another load onto it, and every week the pile grew a little taller, a little uglier, a little more forgotten. For 12 years, one woman kept coming back for it. Her name was Dana Whitfield, and by the time this story ends, the wood nobody wanted would be the foundation of a business worth $420,000. Not because she got lucky, not because someone discovered her, because she spent over a decade figuring out something the sawmill workers walked past every single day without seeing. She was 31 when she first climbed onto that pile, boots sinking into sawdust, looking for a piece of maple with a burl in it. She had no plan for a brand. She didn't even have a workshop, just a garage with a space heater and a table saw her father left behind. What she had was a question that wouldn't leave her alone. Why does everyone agree this wood is worthless when it's clearly still wood? That question is where everything starts. Dana grew up around wood without ever meaning to. Her father ran a small furniture repair shop 2 towns over, the kind of place that fixed grandmother's rocking chairs and never made anyone rich. She'd spend her childhood afternoons sweeping curls of pine off the floor, memorizing the smell of linseed oil, watching him run his thumb along a board before he ever touched a saw to it, like he was asking the wood permission. He died when she was 26. The shop closed within the year. She kept exactly one thing, the table saw, dragged into her garage, tarped, and mostly ignored for the next 5 years while she worked a job in logistics that paid the bills and asked nothing of her. The first time she went to Larson's sawmill, she wasn't hunting for offcuts. She needed a single board to fix a wobbling shelf. The man at the counter waved her toward the back. Reject piles free, take whatever. She almost didn't look, but there was a piece near the top, walnut, maybe 2 feet long, with a black knot the size of a fist right through the center. And something about it stopped her. Not because it was beautiful. It wasn't. It was because it was so obviously rejected, and she recognized the feeling. She took it home along with 3 others. She had no plan for them. She just didn't like the idea of them going into a burn pile. That was the practical reason. The real reason came later, and it had nothing to do with wood at all. She wasn't a natural. This matters because it would be easy to tell this story as though Dana had some hidden gift that only needed the right material to reveal itself. She didn't. Her first attempts at working the offcuts were bad. She tried to plane down the walnut knot to make it disappear, the way you're taught a knot should be treated, sanded flat, filled, hidden. It cracked straight through the center on the second pass. She tried a second piece, an oak wedge with a live edge, and misjudged the grain so badly the router tore out a chunk the size of a coin. 6 failed pieces in, she almost gave the wood up entirely and went back to buying clean pine from the hardware store like a sensible person. What changed her mind was small. She was staring at the cracked walnut piece, irritated, turning it over in her hands when she noticed that the crack had followed the knot in a way that looked almost deliberate, like the wood had a fault line, and the knot sat right on it. She started wondering if the knot wasn't the weakness. Maybe the knot was where the wood was strongest, and everything around it was where it wanted to fail. She didn't hide the knot on her next piece. She built the whole design around it, let the dark, twisted grain sit dead center on a small serving board, sanded it until the contrast between the pale wood and the black knot looked less like a flaw and more like ink spilled on purpose. It was the first piece she didn't want to throw away. Here's what the sawmill workers saw when they looked at the reject pile. Wood that failed to meet a standard. Boards that wouldn't run cleanly through a planer. pieces too small for framing lumber, too knotted for furniture-grade stock, too irregular for anything a lumberyard could price by the board foot. They weren't wrong. By every measure the industry used, that wood was worthless. But Dana had started asking a different question, and it's worth sitting with because it's the question the entire business would eventually be built on. Worthless for what? A board that's useless for a straight table leg might be exactly what you want. For something that's supposed to look like it has history. A knot that ruins a cabinet door might be the single most interesting part of a cutting board. A crack that would fail a structural inspection might, filled with dark resin, become the most striking line in the piece. The defect was never really the problem. Nobody had matched it to the right use. She kept going back to the pile, not weakly, obsessively. The mill workers started setting pieces aside for her without being asked. The ones with the strangest grain, the ugliest knots, the shapes that made no sense for anything. Might as well let her take a crack at it, one of them said once, not knowing how literally that would turn out to be true. Would you have taken that walnut piece home? Or would you have walked past it like everyone else did for 12 years? It's worth sitting with, because the difference between Dana and everyone else at that mill wasn't skill. At this point, it was just attention. 2 years in, Dana had a garage full of cutting boards, small trays and a handful of side tables, and almost nowhere to sell them. She tried a Saturday craft fair on a folding table borrowed from her sister. Price tags written in marker, expecting the knots and the raw edges to scare people off the way they'd scared off the Sawmill's regular buyers. The opposite happened, though not immediately and not dramatically. A woman picked up a small board with a burl right at one corner and asked if it was intentional. Dana said yes, which was only half true at that point. She was still learning to plan for it rather than just work around it. The woman bought it anyway, said it looked like nothing else on the table, and that was the entire first real sale. $42. It wasn't validation exactly. It was smaller than that. It was evidence that at least one person besides her could see what she saw. The growth from there was slow in the way real growth usually is. A few craft fairs became a dozen. A dozen became a small online shop with photos taken on her garage floor. Word moved through a local woodworking group, then a regional one. Repeat customers started asking for custom pieces, a cutting board with a specific knot pattern, a serving tray sized for a particular kitchen. By year 4, she had enough steady orders that she quit logistics and started doing this full-time, which terrified her more than any failed piece of walnut ever had. Her fear wasn't really about money, though money was part of it. It was about what happened if she was wrong. If this thing she'd built out of garbage wood turned out to be a hobby dressed up as a career, and she'd walked away from a stable job to prove it. The setback, when it came, didn't look like failure. It looked like success outgrowing her. By year 6, demand had climbed past what one person working alone in a garage could produce. A boutique home goods store 2 counties over wanted 40 cutting boards a month. A wedding registry site wanted her serving trays listed as a featured item. These were good problems, the kind you're supposed to want. Except she had no way to meet them without either turning away business or compromising the thing that made the business work in the first place. The fact that every piece was chosen and shaped around its own specific flaw. She hired help. Her first employee, a former cabinet shop worker named Ruiz, was skilled and fast and trained like everyone in the industry to treat knots and cracks as problems to eliminate. He filled a knot on a board that Dana had specifically chosen because of that knot. Technically, it was better craftsmanship. It was also, in Dana's eyes, exactly wrong. They argued about it more than once, not about competence, about philosophy. Ruiz kept saying the wood would sell better clean. Dana kept saying that wasn't the point and struggling to explain why, because up to that moment she'd never had to put the reason into words for anyone but herself. It came to a head with a large wholesale order that Ruiz had already started prepping in the conventional way. Filled, sanded smooth, knots minimized, while Dana was away sourcing more stock. She came back to a batch of boards that were competent, sellable, and to her, completely wrong. She had to decide whether to ship them anyway and hit the deadline, or scrap weeks of work and start over on her own terms. She scrapped it. It cost her the wholesale deadline and very nearly the account. If you'd built something out of the very flaws everyone else told you to eliminate, would you have shipped the improved version to make the deadline, or started over? That decision is where the story actually turns. Losing the deadline forced a conversation with the store buyer that changed the direction of everything. Expecting to lose the account entirely, Dana instead found herself trying for the first time to explain her actual process, not the wood, but the system she'd built around choosing it. Because that was the twist, even though nobody, including Dana for a long time, had framed it that way. The valuable thing was never really the offcuts themselves. Offcuts are just wood. The valuable thing was the method she'd spent years developing, a way of reading a flawed piece of lumber and matching its specific defect to the specific design where that defect became the feature. A knot placement guide she'd built in her head, then eventually on paper, then eventually as a training document for anyone she hired. A visual language for what made a crack good versus merely broken. That was what Ruiz hadn't been trained in, because it didn't exist anywhere else to be trained in. It was hers, and it meant the brand wasn't fragile in the way she'd feared. It wasn't dependent on her personally finding and shaping every single piece forever. It was dependent on a process that could be taught, once she understood it well enough to teach it. The buyer, oddly, found this more compelling than the finished boards. She reworked the wholesale order around Dana's original approach on a longer timeline, and the account survived. More than survived. The store started marketing the line specifically around the story of the wood, which brought in a wave of customers who weren't just buying a cutting board, they were buying the idea behind it. That idea is what actually scaled. Not the pile behind the sawmill. Dana couldn't magically make more knotted walnut appear, but the eye for it, formalized, repeatable, teachable. 2 more mills in the region started setting aside their reject piles, for her specifically once word got around. She trained 3 more employees using the system that had cost her the Ruiz argument to even discover she had. Retail partnerships followed. A small line of furniture built the same way followed after that. By year 11, the business had crossed 6 figures in cumulative revenue through steady, unglamorous growth, craft fairs that became wholesale accounts that became retail partnerships that funded better tools, and a real workshop to replace the garage. By the end of year 12, total revenue had passed $420,000. Built the same way the pile itself had been built, one overlooked piece at a time, added up over years nobody was watching closely. Here's a question worth sitting with before we get to the end. Was the wood ever really the secret? Or was it just the thing that forced her to develop the actual secret? A way of seeing that any of us could learn, if we were willing to look as long as she did. 12 years after her first visit, Dana still goes to Larson's. The mill workers don't set pieces aside quietly for her anymore. They call her directly when something unusual comes off the saw, a burl too strange to classify, a crack that splits a board in a shape they know she'll want to see. She still climbs onto the pile sometimes, boots sinking into sawdust, the way she did at 31 with no plan, and a dead father's table saw in her garage. It looks the same as it always did. Knots, splits, wood that fails every standard measure the industry has for what makes lumber worth something. She knows now what she didn't know then. The pile was never actually worthless. It was only waiting for someone patient enough to ask what it might be good for, instead of what it had failed to be. She picks up a piece of oak, turns it over, finds the crack running through it like a line drawn on purpose, and already knows exactly what it's going to become. If there's a piece of that pile still sitting in your own life, the thing you've been told is a flaw, the thing everyone else has already decided isn't worth the effort, this is probably not the last story on this channel that's gonna make you look at it twice. There's another one waiting, if you want to see where the next pile leads.